Hello, my name is Steve, and my goal is to find the world's best performing anchors. Today we're going to focus on this 18 kilogram Knox anchor. It did come out at 18 kilograms or 40 pounds on my scale, and the tip weight in the setting position came out at 10 pounds for a tip to total weight ratio of 25%. I'll mention that of all the anchors that I tested, the tip to total weight ratio ranges between 18% and a high of 50%. A few noteworthy features of the anchor are a very wide and tall shank and overall quite robust construction. You might think that the split between the two sides of the shank would create a weakness. However, if you look underneath, there is sort of a doubled up nature to the shank, kind of a triangular box section. All the welds look very, very nice. Overall, it is a very nicely built anchor. So for the testing of this anchor, I used the 18-foot aluminum fishing boat with the 90 horsepower outboard. It does pull over 1,100 pounds, so it creates quite a bit of pulling force, but it does not have the inertia of the larger test boat. And typically, I test larger anchors with the big boat, but it's on the hard now, so that's just what we've got. I'm actually hoping to fit a windlass to that boat soon and retest all the anchors with that new boat because it has some capabilities that the big boat does not. But in any event, we're not going to be able to make accurate comparisons between today's tests and my previous large anchor tests. I think we can get some general ideas, but again, not terribly accurate. I did conduct all these tests today that you'll see at 5-to-1 scope with a mostly chain rode. It's 80 feet of 5/16 chain and then some number of feet of nylon to make it 5-to-1 scope. The seabeds varied between about 25 and 30 feet. Now the other chests that you've seen of the large anchors, it used 3/8 inch chain and all chain, and I used 3.5-to-1 scope. So again, it's not going to be apples to apples, but I think we can get a pretty good idea. Now some of you have asked, how do I get all this underwater video footage? And it's very simple. It's just a GoPro camera in a waterproof housing, and it's lashed to a slightly modified fishing float. I use this float for the larger anchors because it has a pound or two of buoyancy, but for the small anchors I don't want to interrupt or disrupt the function of the anchor. So this float has been cut down to the point where it has only, I think, about 10 ounces of buoyancy. So that's it. It's very simple. Let's get to that footage. Enjoy. First test is at my sandy mud seabed, and of all the seabeds I test in, I feel this one is probably the most common or represents more seabeds in my area here in the Pacific Northwest than any other. So there's the first initial set. Sets just happened instantaneously, and this is the reset testing. I'm going to do this 10 times. There on the right, you saw the chain ghosting by. I'm driving the boat up overhead. I'm shooting for 3.5 knots, and I just want to see what anchors do when they get violently jerked around. This is something that naturally won't happen too frequently in the natural world, but I think this gives us a very, very good idea of an anchor's ability to not clog or foul with seabed. That first reset was textbook, as is the second. It appeared to me that both times the anchor remained engaged and just pivoted, and boy, it didn't move far at all. The third time, however, that looked more like a partial backflip, so the flukes definitely disengaged from the seabed, and we get a lengthy drag. I can only assume that there is a lump of seabed at the tips of the fluke. But when the boat speed was reduced from the 3 knots down to, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2 knots, it did reset. I'll mention that each time the anchor successfully resets, I do give a pretty good burst of power. You can hear the motor rev up there, and it's at minimum that's about a 500-pound pull. Now we're up to the 7th reset, and as we can see, it's been doing great. The anchor's just been staying put. And for those that are not familiar with the bulk of my testing, this is kind of my standard test that I really started with when I began doing these anchor videos. And I'll say that, you know, there's some anchors that can perform this test perfectly, and it just, no matter how many times, 10 out of 10, it's just perfect instant resets. Others just have a real trouble with it, and they drag profusely. And this anchor is looking like it's certainly better than average, or, you know, it's not quite perfect, but it's doing really quite well. We could hear the chain clicking on the anchor as it drug by, so I nailed the reset course on that one. I don't see that it was a backflip, however. It did rotate, but it looks like it released, and out of the 10, this was the other attempt that wasn't perfect. But like that first longer drag, once the boat speed reduced a bit, it did bite right in. Again, I tested other anchors that once they released, that was kind of it. They never did reset, even if you'd come to a complete stop. So then the 10th and final reset was just great, and because I don't have the windlass on this boat at this time, and I just wanted to preserve the integrity of my back vertebrae, I did not haul the anchor up prior to this deep set testing that I'm now commencing. So I just went right into the deep setting, and I guess that's a disadvantage for this anchor. I didn't get a chance to clean it off and set it again, but it didn't need it. It held the full power, no problem. I am presenting the footage here at 4 times speed, just to keep the video shorter. Note that anchors in this 40-pound plus size range, this level of pull, that 1,100 pounds, that's really nowhere near their maximum capacity. However, there were several anchors that I've tested that were over 40 pounds that could not hold that much thrust. So we don't really know what this anchor's maximum holding power is in this seabed, but at least we know that it is not poor. Little bit of mud left over there, but obviously nothing here. Next test is at my sand and gravel location. This is an area with a lot of current, and the current is running hard here during this test. So much so that the water pressure has pushed the camera away from the anchor to the point that we don't get to see the anchor. I will report, though, that it did dig in immediately, held the boat, and lots of pulling power. And the reset, which was very difficult to achieve 180 degrees, just the current was pushing the boat around so much, it was a real trouble. But I did get that partial 180-degree reset executed, and it worked just fine. This area used to have more gravel. There was visible stones in previous years, but I do believe the seabed has changed. Again, this current, I think, is constantly moving material around, and now we're seeing a greater ratio of sand. Next test is at my cobblestone seabed, and if you go back in my video list to number 83, that's the video that's labeled cobblestone, you'll see where I tested, I can't remember, 18 or 20 anchors here. And the thing that's really stand out about that test and that video is that none of the anchors did really well. The very best anchors were able to set, they rolled upright, and they at least buried their flukes. But no anchor was capable of burying its shank, and the max holding power even of the best anchors was marginal at best. And in fact, even one commenter wisely pointed out that cobblestone shootout, what it really told us was that cobblestone is a place where you should not anchor. And that's a very good point. But I'm a tester, and I test every seabed I can, so here we are. Now, if you scrutinize the fluke of this Knox, you'll notice that it just picked up a passenger. It has a rock jammed into the gap between the two fluke halves. And I don't know if that's causing it to not set here. The rock wasn't present initially, but I can tell you that on this pull, it never developed much more than about 100 pounds of pull. I think maybe once, it kind of held 140 pounds, but just for a brief moment. And we've got so much scope out here, and with so much chain laying on the ground, I gotta believe that a pretty good portion of the holding power is just coming from the chain. Now, there's a crab we're tangling with there, but don't worry about him. He can take care of himself. In fact, that's the toughest crab I've ever seen. He's attacking that anchor. Says, I'm a crab. Just get out of my way. There is a rock jammed in the fluke. Hard. Really hard. Really, really hard. Okay, I'm gonna knock that out and then retest. Okay, this is take 2 for the Knox anchor at the cobblestone. I've got the knock rocked out. I had to bang it out with a hammer. It was jammed in there, hopelessly jammed. All right, 6 feet of water coming up. Okay, with that rock removed, let's see if we get any better performance. And right there, right off the bat, it looks like maybe it is better. Digging in a little bit, did get about 115 pounds of pull here that wasn't moving. So again, I thought, okay, maybe this anchor does have some capability here. But then just a touch more power, and you'll see it drags continuously for a while. I think this anchor would do better if it had a bit more weight in the tip. That tip to total weight ratio I spoke of. I think this would be a seabed where it would improve things. It's kind of just rolling all around. It certainly has a tendency to right itself. And in every other seabed I've tested, that's plenty. But here, I think it could use a bit more. Looking back at my notes, in that cobblestone shootout I did, the best anchors only held a bit more than 400 pounds. They were a little heavier than this. They were closer to 50 pounds than this 40-pounder. So that's kind of the benchmark. If it could do 300 or 400 pounds, I'd say that's great. But you're going to see here the most it ever held was 140, and for this size of anchor, that's pretty poor. So it's going to get a bad mark here in this cobblestone seabed. And the fact that it can collect rocks is another problem. So I guess that'd be my call, is if you've got an anchor in this kind of stone frequently, Knox might not be the best choice. And this was its best set out of all of this dragging right here. Did hold 140 pounds, pretty solid. Next test is in my soft mud location. This mud is quite a bit different than my sandy mud, but just note that this may not be as soft of mud as some other locations such as the Chesapeake. I hear reports there that the mud is so oozy and so liquid-like that the transition between water and mud is undefinable. Here we have a clear surface to the top of the mud. But in any event, the anchor digs in immediately and disappears. It does really well in this seabed. The shootout that you need to look at from my video list to compare is number 86. I called it the soft mud test. And In that test, I was using Panopay to test the larger anchors, and it can only pull about 680 pounds. And a few of those larger anchors were able to hold it. I don't know how much more holding they would have had, but this anchor is doing extremely well. It does have more scope than that test. I used 3.5 to 1 scope in the previous testing, but it was with much heavier chain. So it's not exactly apples to apples, but this anchor does really well. You may hear some clicking and some scraping sounds. That is not rocks in the seabed. Those are shells. There's a significant amount of clamshell in the seabed, but I don't think it's an issue for the anchors. They seem to just push right on through those, no problem. But now here, this is the final power setting I chose. It's 840 pounds of thrust, and I had enough movement that I could detect movement even from the surface. But back before that, at 750 pounds, it was really quite solid. And again, that compares quite favorably with the better anchors that I've tested here. At some point, I do plan to get a windlass for the boat and come back here with all the anchors, and I'll retest. I want to do that veering test that I conducted recently in the sandy mud. I want to do that here. I want to use this boat, and I want to use this same road. So once I get a windlass lashed up, I'll come back with all the anchors and do this exact same test. Here's the mud from that first straight line pull test at Scow Bay. The slot between the flukes is full of mud. There's a shell or two as well. So speaking of that veering test that I'd like to conduct here in this soft mud, I went ahead and did a pull, a 180-degree continuous arcing veer using the same scope, 5 to 1. Got this mostly chain rode, 5/16. This is going to compare to the recent veering test that I conducted, but it was over at the sandy mud site. Totally different seabed. And I noted in that video that just in general, the anchors that did poor in the heavier sandy mud did really well here in the soft mud, and vice versa. And it appears to be following suit. This anchor has dove in, disappeared. It held a straight line 500-pound initial pull, and then without letting up on the throttle, I just turned the wheel of the boat just a hair and allow the boat to arc sideways through 180 degrees. And this anchor's buried so deeply, we don't have any idea what it's doing. Often you'll see the seabed sort of cracking as you can kind of tell where the anchor is down below moving, but it's so well buried, we don't see anything, and it drags the camera down under the mud with it. I don't think the anchor is the length of the camera tether in depth. I just think that the mud trapped the tether. But in any event, it executed that veer perfectly, and then held 930 pounds with only a little motion. Motion then picked up speed at the final thrust setting of 1020 that I used here. So again, it's not exactly apples to apples to my previous testing here due to the different boat, different road, but gut feeling says this is a good performing anchor in this soft mud. Came up surprisingly clean. These last clips are going to be reruns. These were lifted directly from my veering test, video number 95. You can go check that out, where I tested 17 anchors all back to back. It's back at the sandy mud, and this anchor released twice at the holding power that I chose for the larger anchors. After the second one here, I just decided that, well, it's not going to make it 180 degrees, so I downgraded to 500 pounds of thrust, which is what I used for the smaller anchors, and it worked fine. I didn't give it a full power at the end of the veer. It was early in the testing, and I just hadn't established my protocol properly. So I'll retest this again with all chain, or mostly chain here, when I get the chance, hopefully with a windlass on board. But it did about like the rest of the roll bar anchors. They all had some issue, either reduction in holding power or just an inability to stay engaged through 180 degrees of veer in this sandy mud seabed. Did come up spotless though. It just sheds mud just fine. Okay, well that was a good first look at this Knox anchor. There's certainly going to be more testing as I progress along in this quest of mine. But initially, I would say this is a pretty solid performing anchor. Did not clog bad. What was it? 8 out of 10 of those resets in the sandy mud were just perfect. Only 2 of those were longer drags, but then it did reset. And that's certainly far better than a couple of other much more popular anchors did in that seabed. Sand and gravel site, it did just great. The cobblestone site, that was this anchor's weakness, and I attribute it to a fairly low tip weight and, well, just the overall shape. Maybe it was the blunt, sort of squared off tips. It just had trouble going underneath rocks. It just sort of pushed them out of the way and rode up on top. Really, the only other anchor in this size range that did worse was the CQR in the cobblestone. At the soft mud site, however, it was wonderful. Again, we're not going to get apples to apples scientific comparisons because we were using a different road, different scope, different boat. But this did really well. Boy, it dove way out of sight. On one of those pulls, the chain came up with mud embedded into the links for the first 10 feet. It tells me this anchor was very, very well buried. It did hold really well. And I do intend to get all the anchors back out to the soft mud site. I want to do that veering test, and I want to do it with this smaller boat and the all-chain rode, or mostly chain rode. I'm going to need a windlass fitted, and if I can't find a second-hand windlass, I might just take the windlass off Panopay temporarily, fit it to the small boat, and test all the anchors with chain. This anchor, I did all the pulling today by hand, and I tell you, my back was really feeling it toward the end of the day. Well, I hope you enjoyed that first look at this Knox anchor. Stay tuned, there's certainly going to be more testing of it. Till next time, you guys keep anchoring safely. So long.